Nick had been traveling for work for the past 6 months, hopping from city to city, always booking through Airbnb. This time, he found himself in a small, picturesque town nestled in the hills of New England. The photos of the property he had booked were stunning, a quaint cottage with a rustic charm, surrounded by lush greenery. It seemed perfect for a quiet weekend to unwind before his next business meeting. He arrived late in the afternoon, the sun beginning to set as he pulled into the gravel driveway. The house looked even better in person. The host, a middle-aged man named Peter, greeted him warmly. Peter seemed friendly enough, with an easy smile and a firm handshake. He gave Nick a quick tour of the house, showing him the cozy living room with its stone fireplace, the well-equipped kitchen, and the snug bedroom upstairs. After Peter left, Nick settled in, unpacking his bags and making himself a cup of coffee. He took a seat on the front porch, enjoying the serene view of the woods. As the sky darkened, he decided to call it a night and headed inside. Before going to bed, he locked all the doors and checked the windows, a habit he had developed over years of traveling. Nick slept soundly until around 3 a.m. when he was jolted awake by a loud noise. He sat up in bed, heart racing, straining to hear any other sounds. There it was again, a creaking noise like someone was walking downstairs. His mind raced through logical explanations. Maybe Peter had forgotten something and came back, or perhaps it was just the house settling. But the sound continued, slow and deliberate. He grabbed his phone, turning on the flashlight, and cautiously made his way downstairs. The house was eerily silent now. Nick checked the front door. It was still locked. He moved to the kitchen, then the living room, finding nothing out of place. Feeling slightly foolish but still uneasy, he returned to bed. The next morning, Nick mentioned the noise to Peter in a casual text. Peter replied quickly, assuring him it was probably just the house settling, and that he shouldn't worry. Determined to enjoy his stay, Nick pushed the incident to the back of his mind and spent the day exploring the town. That night, as he was getting ready for bed, he made sure to lock up once more. Around midnight, just as he was drifting off, he heard it again, the same creaking noise, this time closer, like it was coming from the staircase. He bolted upright, his heart pounding. He listened intently, clutching his phone. Summoning his courage, Nick decided to investigate. He tiptoed to the top of the stairs and peered down. The darkness below was thick, and his flashlight cut through it in thin beams. The stairs were empty. He slowly descended, step by step, the old wood creaking under his feet. He reached the bottom and shone his light around, still finding nothing out of the ordinary. Frustrated and exhausted, he turned to go back upstairs when his phone buzzed with a new message from Peter. It was odd. Who texts at this hour? He opened it and read, "Are you okay? I got a strange alert from the security system." Nick's blood ran cold. He hadn't noticed any security cameras or systems in the house. He quickly typed back, "I'm fine, just heard noises again. Is there a camera system here?" Peter responded, "No, I meant the motion sensors. I installed them recently. Must be faulty. Don't worry about it." Feeling unsettled but trying to brush it off, Nick returned to bed. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next day, he decided to check for any signs of hidden cameras or surveillance equipment. He searched the living room, the kitchen, and even behind paintings and furniture. Nothing. That evening, Peter showed up unexpectedly, claiming he was in the area and wanted to check on Nick personally. He brought a bottle of wine, insisting they share a drink. Nick, though wary, agreed. They chatted for a while, but Nick couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Something about Peter seemed off. As the night progressed, Nick felt drowsier than usual. The wine must have been stronger than he thought. Peter kept talking, but Nick struggled to keep up, his vision blurring. He barely registered Peter saying something about a surprise before he blacked out. Nick woke up hours later, disoriented and lying on a living room floor. His head throbbed, and his mouth felt dry. He glanced around, the room dimly lit by the morning light seeping through the curtains. Peter was nowhere to be seen. Panic set in as Nick realized he couldn't remember much after the wine. He stumbled to his feet, checking his phone. No new messages. He decided to leave immediately, grabbing his belongings and rushing to his car. As he drove away, he glanced back at the house, a shiver running down his spine. His phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number. "You're lucky you left. Don't come back." Whoever had been there had left in a hurry, leaving behind a notebook. Nate picked up the notebook, its pages filled with hurried, almost frantic writing. Most of it was incoherent, but one entry stood out. "He watches from the woods. Do not trust the host. He is not what he seems." Nate's mind reeled. The host? He had exchanged a few messages with the host on errand, but they were all polite, professional. Nothing out of the ordinary. Could this be the same person? He needed answers, but he also needed to stay safe. He returned to the cabin, feeling more paranoid with each passing moment. The sun was setting again, and the shadows lengthened, adding to his anxiety. He decided to confront the host, hoping it would provide some clarity. Using the cabin's landline, he called the number provided in the errand listing. It rang several times before going to voicemail. Nate left a message, trying to keep his voice steady, asking the host to come by the cabin the next morning. That night, he barely slept. The tapping returned, louder and more erratic. He stayed in bed, gripping a kitchen knife he had taken for protection. His mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Morning brought no relief. There was no sign of the host, no new messages or notes. Nate decided to take matters into his own hands. He drove to the nearest town, about an hour away, hoping to get some answers. At a small diner, he asked the locals about the cabin. Most were dismissive, but one old man seemed willing to talk. He told Nate that the cabin had a dark history. The previous owner, a reclusive man, had disappeared years ago under mysterious circumstances. Since then, strange occurrences have been reported by the few who dared to stay there. Nate's unease grew. He returned to the cabin, determined to leave as soon as possible. But as he packed his bags, he found another note, this one taped to his car window. "He's closer than you think." Panic set in. He threw his bags into the car and sped down the narrow road, heart pounding. He drove for miles, not stopping until he reached a larger town with a police station. He reported everything, but without concrete evidence, there was little they could do. Nate checked into a motel, not willing to risk another night in the cabin. He spent the evening trying to piece together the clues. Who was watching him? What did they want? Just as he began to feel a semblance of safety, his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize, but he answered anyway, hoping for some resolution. A voice, distorted and chilling, whispered, "You can't run from me, Nate." His blood ran cold. The line went dead, leaving him in a state of terror. Nate realized that the nightmare was far from over. Whoever was behind this knew him, knew his every move. As he sat in the dim motel room, fear and exhaustion consuming him, Nate understood one horrifying truth. He was being hunted, and there was no escaping the shadows that had followed him from the cabin. Nate had been looking forward to this getaway for months. The demands of his job and the noise of the city had worn him thin. He needed a break, somewhere quiet, secluded, and away from the bustling life he knew too well. That's why the old cabin he found on Airbnb seemed perfect. It was nestled deep in the woods, far from any town, promising solitude and peace. The drive took longer than he anticipated. As the roads narrowed and the trees grew denser, Nate started to feel the weight of his decision. But he shook off the doubt. This was what he needed, a complete disconnection from the world. When he finally arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cabin. It was rustic, almost picturesque, exactly as the photos had shown. He parked his car and stepped out, stretching his legs and breathing in the fresh forest air. The silence was almost eerie, a stark contrast to the constant noise of the city. He found the key under the mat, just as the host had promised. Inside, the cabin was cozy but sparsely furnished. A fireplace dominated one wall, and there was a small kitchenette, a table with 2 chairs, and a single bedroom. It was simple, but it had everything he needed. Nate spent the first few hours unpacking and exploring the cabin. There was no cell service, but that was part of the appeal. He lit a fire, made himself a simple dinner, and settled down with a book. The quiet was unnerving at first, but gradually he began to relax. As night fell, the cabin creaked and groaned, the sounds of an old structure settling in the cool night air. Nate dismissed them as normal, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone. He kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see someone staring back at him. But there was nothing, just darkness and the occasional rustle of leaves. He went to bed early, exhausted from the drive and the stress of the past few weeks. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and he drifted off quickly, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. Sometime in the middle of the night, Nate awoke with a start. At first, he wasn't sure what had disturbed him. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cabin was cold. He lay still, listening. There it was again, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from outside, near the back of the cabin. Heart pounding, he got up and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. He could barely see anything, but the tapping continued. It sounded almost deliberate, like someone tapping a stick against the side of the cabin. Nate grabbed a flashlight and cautiously opened the back door. The night air was frigid, and he shivered as he stepped outside. He swept the beam of the flashlight across the yard, but saw nothing. The tapping had stopped. Suddenly, he felt exposed, vulnerable. He hurried back inside, locking the door behind him. Maybe it was just an animal, he told himself. He returned to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, Nate found fresh scratches on the back wall of the cabin. They were shallow but deliberate, forming a pattern he couldn't quite decipher. He took pictures with his phone, feeling a chill despite the morning sun. He decided to take a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear his mind. The woods were beautiful, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Several times he stopped and turned, expecting to see someone, but there was never anyone there. When he returned to the cabin, he found the front door ajar. He was sure he had locked it. Inside, everything seemed undisturbed, but his sense of unease grew. That night, the tapping returned, louder and more insistent. Nate lay in bed, heart racing, unable to ignore it. He felt trapped, caught between the fear of staying and the danger of leaving. He needed to get to the bottom of this, but the darkness outside was impenetrable. He finally drifted into a restless sleep, haunted by dreams of shadowy figures and cryptic messages. The next morning, he resolved to leave, but as he packed, he found a note slipped under the door. It read, "Don't trust him." Nate's heart pounded. Who was him? He was alone, wasn't he? Nate's mind raced as he reread the note. The urgency to leave was now tempered with a gnawing need to understand what was happening. He decided to stay one more day, hoping to uncover the truth. He spent the morning scouring the cabin for clues. The scratches on the back wall seemed like they might be a code, but he couldn't make any sense of them. He found no hidden doors or compartments, no more notes. The cabin seemed ordinary, yet was anything but. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, Nate decided to check the surrounding area. He walked a perimeter around the cabin, looking for any signs of activity. About 50 yards into the woods, he found something that made his blood run cold, a makeshift campsite. It was hidden well, with a small tent, a fire pit, and some scattered belongings. Nick's hands trembled as he read the message. He sped up, his heart pounding. Who had sent the message? Was it Peter? Or someone else? He needed to get out of town and find a safe place to think. He drove to the nearest city, checked into a hotel, and locked himself in the room. Still shaken, he considered calling the police. But what could he say? He had no concrete evidence, just a series of unsettling events and a threatening message. Instead, he decided to dig deeper into Peter and the Ayrton property. He pulled out his laptop and began his research. Peter's Ayrton profile was sparse, just a few reviews, all positive. He searched Peter's name but found nothing unusual. Next, he looked up the property's address. What he found sent chills down his spine. There had been a string of strange occurrences at that location over the years. Previous renters reporting odd noises, items going missing, and even one case of a renter disappearing without a trace. Nick realized he needed more information. He decided to contact previous guests. After some sleuthing, he managed to track down a couple who had stayed at the cottage a few months prior. They agreed to speak with him over the phone. The couple, Lisa and Mark, recounted their experience. They too had heard strange noises and felt a constant sense of unease. They also mentioned Peter's unexpected visits, always under the guise of checking on them. Lisa confessed that she had felt drugged after one of his visits, but had dismissed it as paranoia. Nick's suspicion deepened. He thanked them and hung up, his mind racing. He had to find out what Peter was hiding. He decided to return to the town, but this time, he would stay incognito and gather evidence. He checked into a different errand under a fake name and set up a series of small cameras around the property, especially around the cottage. He also purchased a motion detector alarm for his own safety. He then spent the next few days observing the cottage from a distance, noting Peter's comings and goings. One night, as he was reviewing the footage, he noticed something odd. Peter was frequently entering the house during the late hours and staying for long periods. Nick decided it was time to confront him directly but needed to catch him in the act. The next night, Nick set up his cameras to record Liv and waited until he saw Peter enter the cottage. He then called the local police, reporting suspicious activity and a possible break-in. He knew the police wouldn't take him seriously without evidence, so he shared the live feed from his cameras. The police arrived within minutes. Nick watched as they knocked on the door, and receiving no answer, forced their way in. Moments later, they escorted a handcuffed Peter out of the house. Nick hurried to the scene, identifying himself and showing the officers his recordings. Inside the house, the police found a hidden room in the basement, filled with surveillance equipment. It was clear Peter had been spying on his guests. More disturbing was the collection of personal items from various renters, including Nick's own belongings, which he hadn't even realized were missing. Peter was arrested, and the police began a deeper investigation. They discovered evidence linking him to several disappearances, including the renter who had vanished months earlier. It turned out Peter had been running a twisted game, drugging and surveilling his guests for his own sick pleasure. Nick felt a mix of relief and horror. He was glad to have survived and helped catch Peter, but the experience left him deeply scarred. He decided to take a break from traveling and spend time with family, needing to feel safe and grounded again. Months later, as he settled into a new routine, Nick couldn't shake the feeling that he had been lucky. He had trusted his instincts and acted when things felt wrong. The ordeal had changed him, making him more cautious but also more aware of the darkness that can hide behind seemingly innocent facades. One night, as he was reflecting on the past year, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You may have stopped Peter, but there are others. Always watch your back." Nick's heart raced, but he was determined not to live in fear. He knew now that vigilance and intuition were his best defenses. He deleted the message and resolved to move forward, always aware, always prepared, and never taking safety for granted again.